So I guess that brings us back to our first podcast, Chairman of the Boards. We have the chairman here, Brian Omilion.
Hello.
We have Grant.
Hello.
Goodwood Grant.
Goodwood Grant. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. And it's I think it's a pretty cool thing that we're doing here, because I think one thing that is often never happens, at least that I'm aware of in the pedalboard world, is sort of cooperation between what could be viewed, I guess, from the outside as competitors, but really, we're all about the same objective: getting the world better tone, and better tone means a happier world overall. So I'm so glad that we can come together, that we can be here to discuss the topics of the day, whether that's crazy wet dry wet rigs, or just how to get better tone out of your guitar and amplifier. We're here to help facilitate all that stuff, and I think we're going to yield some really interesting conversation topics between the three of us and our experiences and all the things that we do. So welcome to Chairman of the Boards, episode 1, and we were going to kick it off this week doing some stuff about wet dry wet rigs. We put out collectively some questions on Instagram where people responded about wet dry wet rigs, what their barriers were, and maybe we can break some of this stuff down, talk about advantages, disadvantages, running mono systems versus stereo, 4-cable method, 5-cable method. I know this is something that we get asked a lot, and I'm sure, because I don't build rigs really anymore. I build like, one a month, maybe, where you guys are building, I mean, sometimes it seems like you guys are making multiple pedal boards every week. What's like a standard week in terms of pedal boards for you guys?
I think Brian's probably about one a day at this point from,
right.
from Instagram. I think.
Do you sleep, Brian?
I do. Well, when my kids aren't waking me up, yeah. I try to have a 3-day, like I'm on one right now. You can't see it. It's back. It's this one right here.
Yeah, we can see a little. I see a little bit. If you're looking at this on YouTube, you'll see it.
Yeah.
If you're listening to it, you will not see
just
it.
envision a big old pedal board, 32 by 16. But I mean, I try to do between like 2 or 3 a week. When I do more of the Travel Plus, your Vertex boards, I can crank out a couple extra a week. I've been getting a lot of those, which is amazing. But I don't want to rush. I'm going to take my time and do it correctly. It also, with the stores, I get stopped so much. People are like, oh, you're working, you do 40 hours worth of builds, you should crank out one every day. I'm like, oh, there's also a boutique store that I'm in. Like, I have my phone on silent at the shop, and they're like, did you hear the phone ring? I was like, no, because I don't want to answer the phone. Like, I need to build this board, or I get pulled out front to cash something out for some picks or something. So my goal is at least 2 to 3. It's been on the 2 side because of weather and health and whatnot, with the flu. But yeah, that's it for me. It's about 2 or 3. If on a good day, if I can get more than 2 done, then I'm happy.
Yeah. I would presume it also has to do with how big the board is, right?
It does.
Like
yeah.
A giant rig is going to take more time, as we know.
Yeah, I do a lot of PVC 6s and 10s, so those are very time consuming.
Yeah, you're the PVC king. I mean, RJM owes you a debt of gratitude.
Yeah, I have lots of behind me. If you're on YouTube, you can see it. I got all these PVCs, and I got PVC 10s and stuff. It's just,
and I see like it looks like you got like some power supplies back there.
Yeah, Voodoo Lab and Strymon. We just restocked Strymon because I go through it like crazy. So those are my big ones.
What about Goodwood, Grant? What would you say is like an average pedal board output on a weekly?
Yeah, so I'm similar. I probably build less pedal boards than you do, actually, Mason. But I like the guys in California. They'll do 1 big board a week is kind of the goal, and then we have the shop in Australia, and they'll do probably 1 to 2 a month. And then I'm up here in Canada, which just opened up as a shop, so pretty new up in Canada. So I'll do maybe 1 every 4 to 6 weeks up here in Canada. So it kind of depends on the shop. America is by far the busiest. Right. But one of the things I think all 3 of us have in common, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure we're all huge RJM fans. Like, Guys ask me every week, like, what MIDI, looper, switcher, what should I get? And I always start with, you need to consider RJM, and then I'll go from there. But yeah, big fans.
Yeah. RJM is definitely, for a lot of these rigs, they're the the Michelob man of the game. They're always they're reliable. They're the sizing and just sort of the foresight that Ron had in making this thing. I think it just really heads off so many things where a lot of the other switchers fall short, and also is compatible in a lot of the systems that we're going to be talking about today, whether that's wet, dry, wet, or whether that's wet, dry, or 4-cable method. There's so many things that does, and I'm really impressed with that. I would say if I had to put a close second to it, it would be Musicom Lab. But I think where the biggest fall off between them, I think, is really in the software. RJM software is just so easy and intuitive, and once you understand it,
that's the big thing.
Oh yeah. You can it'll be really hard for you to deviate, I think, from RJM once you sort of have the understanding of the inner workings of what it is that those systems do and how the back end software. But I have to say, the other big thing about RJM is you send Ron an email.
Oh my gosh.
At 9:30 in the morning, and by 9:35 he's got a response for you and has worked out an entire or even maybe exported like a version of the software that you can just upload right into your PVC to fix whatever issue you're having.
Yeah.
So very lovely people, family owned. Him and his wife Sherry and their daughters are like the main people.
It's
pretty cool.
It's so cool.
Yeah. It's old school. Man. But wet, dry, wet rigs are our topic of today.
Okay.
We've all had experience with these. It seems to be like, for the last few years, has really been a buzzword. People really like to use it. It gets thrown around all the time. I think maybe we should start with how maybe it's defined in its various incarnations, because there's sort of multiple interpretations about what wet, dry, wet means. So maybe we could go through that first as sort of like a setting the definitions, and then we can dive into kind of maybe some of the issues that are commonly had, and maybe bring in some of our Instagram polling that we had done this week.
Yeah, I think if I can just jump in, I think there has to be a giant caveat towards the beginning of this podcast of, if all of this seems extremely confusing right off the bat, like what is wet, dry, wet? What's the 4-cable method? I use all my pedals and I plug into my amp, and that's all I've ever done. All of this can be broken down easily into like one bite-sized piece at a time. So if it's intimidating at the top, it's all good. We'll get there, and don't freak out. But I think for me, I did a series. I'm going to probably redo it soon just because it's time. I did a series on everything wet, dry, wet. And I went through, and I know, Mason, you've done a bunch of stuff, and Brian, you're all over it with the setups and Instagram and all that. There are so many ways to approach wet, dry, wet. And if I'm on a setup call with a customer, just chatting through, what do you want to do with your rig? If wet, dry, wet comes up, guaranteed the call is going half an hour overtime. It happens every single time because there's so many points to consider. And again, you can keep it bite-sized and you can approach it one thing at a time. But I think in my mind, if someone says, I want a wet, dry, wet rig, if I'm going to boil that down to the simplest possible form, you're going to be running 3 lines, not necessarily amps. You might be using an amp sim, or you might be, using not a physical tube amp. But you'll have 1 amp that's dedicated to a dry sound. Now, what the definition of dry is, we can get to. And then you'll have another 2 amps dedicated to, your delays and your reverbs and maybe your chorus and potentially a tremolo, or, your wet and modulation effects. In my mind, and I'm happy to be corrected by you guys or challenged, but in my mind, that is the simplest possible way you could define a wet, dry, wet rig. And the outworking of that is where the real complexity kind of comes in.
Mm-hmm.
What do you say, Brian? Wet, dry, wet. What if we're starting with sort of baseline definitions? Anything?
I mean, that's as simple as I stated to people. I don't get a lot of wet, dry, wet. I actually just had a guy that wanted one, so I added on like a little patch bay. I'm very simple. I can do very basic patch bay boxes. So I was like, so I like made one up, and he loves it, and he's like, yeah, I love it. So, I love it. Do you do it? And I was like, no, I don't have the mental capacity to deal with that when I'm not at work, and my front of house guy would kill me if I brought 3 amps. Yeah, I have an Iridium, and that's about it. Like I'm not gonna go into that, but no, everything Grant said is the same. That's as simple as it gets. Like wet, dry, 3 lines. Like, oh yeah, that makes, for the longest time for me, I was like, I did one for a guy starting out, and I was like, what the heck is the reason for that? And like talking to people and to you guys about it. Is my alarm going off? Is that it just, it made more sense when they broke it down like that. Like, you have 2 lines that are wet, 1 that's dry. I was like, oh, that's simple. It's not all these crazy diagrams. Like, diagrams, when you Google that stuff, you start to see the most craziest effects loop routing, and you're just like, whoa, that's more than I want to do. So yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I think the piece that I would add to this is sort of the emanating component, where this was really a response to guitar players in the 80s wanting to recreate what an engineer or a producer would do to the guitar sound in the studio, where they would record an amplifier with a mic, and then after the microphone of the dry amp, they would then use an aux send or an insert in the mixer or in the mix bus, and they would blend in external effects in post after the mic. And then those would be in stereo, and typically they would hard pan left and right. And if you're watching on YouTube, you'll see my hands split apart. They'll hard pan the stereo image, hard left, hard right, pan those, and then have the original dry sound right up the middle. And as guitar players became more sophisticated, and then there were rig builders that could actually help integrate this stuff, like Robert Bradshaw, you started to see guitar players buying equipment that used to really only be reserved for recording studios, like an Eventide H3000 or a Lexicon, PCM series reverb or delay, or a TC Electronic 2290. And they would start to put those in guitar racks so that those guitar players could reproduce the same processing that they were getting in the studio from the engineers or producers of the records that they were working on. And so it was really just a response to being able to take studio gear and then synthesize it so that it could be used in a guitar specific context. And the idea is that you would do all of your delay and reverb and modulation processing after the dry amplifier. And in this case, they kind of morphed instead of going after the mic line. And some people still did that. But for the most case, they would take a line level output of the dry amp. And that's basically just a line off of the output transformer. And the way this was achieved is there'd be, a little box that would have a speaker through. So your amp head would connect to it, and then your speaker cabinet would connect to it on one side. And then it would produce an unbalanced line output with a volume control, maybe a 10K pot and a volume control, so you could attenuate that or make it, the right level for the equipment that it was feeding. And then it would feed, either a series of parallel mixers in some cases, or in other cases, just the effects themselves. And the only reason that the parallel mixers are really involved in a lot of the classic wet, dry, wet rigs is because a lot of that studio gear didn't have any dry signal in it. So the only way to reintroduce the dry signal was to actually have the parallel mixer there so that you could blend that back in, because it was just made to be in a mix bus. It was return only. So it was this was part of the reason why mixers were so important to be used in those contexts. But I know that that's kind of getting way out there, and that's kind of talking about, sort of the Stone Age in terms of wet, dry, wet. There's certainly a lot of different ways to go there. But I've always said, and this is something we can talk about, that really what those guys were trying to do would almost be equivalent with today's gear of just doing a 5-cable method, which is basically a stereo effects loop methodology, where you have stereo wet effects after the preamp section. That's kind of the closest to what they were really trying to do, because on a lot of those early wet dry rigs, the dry cab wasn't even on the stage. It was just a load. And then the load was just feeding stereo effects. So it was really just a stereo rig, and they were loading the dry amp. And so the wet had dry on the same amount of dry in it, or had a lot of dry in it. It wasn't 100% wet. So anyway, those are sort of maybe our baseline of where we're starting. And I've seen other versions where people will put different sorts of splitters after dry effects, or even before you hit any dry effects. Like I've even seen like a splitter right up front, like guitar comes in, hits a splitter, that splitter immediately goes to the wet processing effects, delays, reverbs, modulation, and then the guitar also at the same time is hitting all the dry effects, so that there isn't any impact, or they're reducing the impact of the distortion effects and how those might affect modulation and delay, because they're creating that split earlier. And then we see other people that put it after the distortion section, and then you have one line that's dedicated distortion to a dry amp, and then the wet effects are after that, either in mono or in stereo. And really the only distinction between wet dry and wet dry wet is wet dry wet is a stereo processing that's happening after the dry amp, whereas just wet dry is just mono processing of the delay and reverb signal and modulation. So we got those blanket statements about things.
I think as well, I'm sorry, I just had to change my mic because I think I was getting some issues there. But I think the biggest thing to consider as well is wet, dry, wet. If you're asking, like similar to what you were just saying, and just off the back of what you were just saying, Mason, is the biggest thing is just the word I come back to is always separation. So if you have a typical rig that's running guitar, gain stages, modulation, and wet effects into an amp, the possibility of muddying up your signal is higher than if you were to run a dedicated dry amp that just gets all of the transients of your right hand, the pick attack, the feel of the guitar, and then you're layering in wet effects on top. You get separation between dry and wet. And the other huge pro that a lot of people don't consider is in a live setting, however you run wet, dry, or wet, dry, wet, whatever approach you take, front of house will get individual control over a dry amp, and they can mix in the amount they want, and a wet section, and they can mix in as much as they want. And you and your monitors can do the exact same thing independently of front of house. Everyone gets the best possible mix options, rather than in series. Whatever you send front of house, all they get is a master volume up and down. They cannot separate wet from dry after the fact. And so I think separation is a really key term in a live setting as well.
Yeah, because you're running your dry signal in dry and wet in parallel. So the wet is in parallel with the dry, and then you can mix it acoustically, because the impact of the dry amp is not seen in every single amplifier. So you have your dry, and there is, of course, dry in the wet mixes, unless you run 100% wet, which some guys do. But most people, even in the classic rigs, almost always had some dry in the wet cabinets. So yeah, running it in parallel is essentially what's happening in those situations, and why it's desirable. And this gets back to the original interpretation, which I didn't mention before, is that another big reason why guys did this is they didn't have Pro Tools. So if you had modulation and reverb and delay printed on a track and you were a session musician, you couldn't remove it. Whereas if you had individual lines for your dry signal in your wet processing, the producer or the engineer could say, well, we actually don't really like what you did with that particular track, but we still have your dry reference, which we can reamp or we can add our own processing to in post-production. And we're not stuck with this one interpretation that had way too much chorus and we just didn't really like it. And so it always gave them sort of like a safety net that they could go back to, because they always had a mic'd dry amp all the time.
Yeah.
And they didn't necessarily have to use the wet processing because those were on their own channels separately from the dry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
I think the other cool thing as well, nowadays, I mean, I'm personally not recording on tape myself all that often, but I think one of the really cool things that you can do is overcome some of the downsides of a wet dry rig. And in my mind, the biggest downside is the amount of gear you have to haul. You basically have to have a pickup truck if you're going to run a wet rig live. Like 3 amps, pedalboard, guitar, maybe multiple guitars. Like that's a lot of gear. It's not fitting in a Prius. And so I think the coolest thing with this nowadays, and something that I experimented a ton with back home in Australia, I played for a church there called Hillsong a lot. And so when I wanted to experiment with my rig, I said, I want to try a wet rig. I'm going to need 4 lines of guitar, but I want your approval before I do it. It's all for an experiment. I just want to see if it works. And they were like, yep, let's do it. So I went home, I built the rig, but I didn't want to haul 3 amps for obvious reasons. So I put an HX Stomp amp sim on my stereo wet lines with a nice preamp before it. And then I just used a matchless Lightning, a real amp, for my dry. And it sounded huge. So 2 mics on my matchless, 1 left, 1 right for my wet effects. And the reason I think it sounded so good is because the core tone was a matchless Lightning, which it's hard to pull a bad sound on. All my dry, all of the pick attack, like I was saying before, was going to the matchless. And then everything else was in parallel for my wet effects in kill dry, which we can probably chat about later. And it was just kind of placed on top of that core sound. So it didn't have to sound as good as the real matchless, although it sounded really nice. But you can do something like wet, dry, wet with only needing to bring 1 amp, or a typical 1 amp setup as far as gear goes. So with what's available today, you can do a lot. So long as you have the available lines, you can get away with a huge sounding rig with tons of separation, but you only need to bring 1 amp.
Yeah. Well, it's actually funny that you're saying that. So I'm part of a church plant, and our sound guy's like, yeah, so I took the system is stereo, but our ears are mono, which sucks because, I mean...
I'm sorry.
That's what I'm saying. I'm working on it. But he's like, I doubled your line, so I have a secondary one to push. And I was like, what's the reason? He goes, I just need more something. And I was like, okay. And I'm running an Iridium, and I love it. So I've actually been... I have a little 18x7 flat board with some DIs on it. 1 Iridium set for stereo, and then the other Iridium set to do just a dry out. So it is a wet, dry, wet, but he's getting the stereo signal wet and the single dry from this little mini board, and he can blend it just like what you're saying. So even more compact, because I have 2 kids I got to bring in. We got to set up at 6 a.m. I'm not trying to bring my Jackson amp with me or whatever amp I pull from the shop to bring with me to take, because I also, for some reason, have to have my White Falcon with me and my Duojet, even though they both have the same pickups. Like, I got to have them both. So, like, the less amount I can bring, the better. So I've been rocking this little board, and it's actually pretty cool, and it sounds good, and it's doing exactly like what you're saying. So I agree with you that the technology now is just like is a game changing.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think that this goes to one of the questions that we had prompted our respective audiences with, in terms of what is needed. I'm just going to share my screen here real quick for those who are watching on YouTube. Is, we can see one of the things that we have here is one of the questions we asked and in our poll was, is one of the reasons that you don't run a more complex signal path, is it because you don't have enough gear or the amps to do it? Or also speaking to, what we touched on slightly here, which was we don't have the venue to accommodate it, whether, your church or your stage or whatever it is that you're playing doesn't have the number of channels or has a mono PA or whatever the case may be. And I think you guys touched on something that's really critical here, which is you don't need to have 3 amps to do it. You really, in my opinion, are not at any advantage of using anything more than like a high quality dry amp that you're happy with. Because even in the most iconic wet rigs ever made, whether it's Michael Landau or Dan Huff or any of these guys, they were using super linear power amps on the wet side. So they had really no color. They were very linear. They didn't have a real, some of them were even solid state and weren't even tube, or some of them that were tube were 200 watt KT88 power amps. And so these didn't have the color of a Matchless or some beautiful fill in the blank amp for the wet sound, because they really wanted to maintain the cleanliness and the purity of the wet processing separately from the dry sound that had all of the color and saturation and a lot of that character that we really like of, let's say, a tube amp. And so I almost think it's more advantageous to use something like, let's say, a stereo Cab Zeus or a 2 Notes Cab M or some sort of speaker and mic simulation that you set to something that is relatively linear. Let's say, something with an EV style speaker in it, or a lot of people back then, even though it's not a particular linear speaker, a vintage 30, setting that with a close mic 57 setting, which both the Cab Zeus and the Cab M have. And that could be what you feed your wet lines to. And you don't need to have 2 more amps. You have 1 amp that's mic'd, you use a line out, you feed your wet effects that are happening in parallel, and those feed, your GFI Cab Zeus in stereo or your Cab M, and then those produce, XLR outputs, which can then feed to your board. And if you're in ears or you have wedges in front of you, you're going to hear the wet processing through there, and that can be mixed by your sound man or sound woman to taste, and you can mix it all acoustically, and it just requires that 1 amp. Mm-hmm. And that's glorious, because you have no consequence in terms of how much gear you need to bring. Those 2 things that I mentioned, and there are others, can fit on a pedal board. It can be powered by 9 or 12 volts. You have everything now in a pedal board format. It's travelable, sounds great. And again, I think the misnomer that a lot of people have in terms of the amount of gear, they think they have to have 3 Matchless Lightnings, or 3 Dumble Overdrive Specials to run.
Could be argued. Could be argued.
Right. You could have 3, but I would say that your wet, dry, wet sound would not be improved by having those, because again, the power amps are all that's used in the wet scenario if you're doing a traditional wet, dry, wet rig. So you're not even using the preamp sections. None of the knobs on your amplifier will work, except for the volume control, which, because everything else is bypassed. Most of the controls on our amps are all in the preamp section. So maybe you have your master volume, maybe your reverb works, maybe your presence knob works. That's it. So and sometimes even your volume knob won't work depending on where it is in the location, and you're having to use the volume control on your line out box to set how hot the signal is that's feeding the effects. But I think that you totally don't need 3 amps. I think get 1 good amp and get a really nice cab sim. And you can even do it with the Iridium. I forget on the Iridium, and maybe Brian or Grant, you can tell me, because somebody was asking me about this the other day, and I was thinking, how would I run a wet, dry, wet rig if I were going to do the Strymon Iridium? And the first thing I thought was, it has that room sound right on it, which is sort of kind of like a reverb. Yep. Is that the same on left and right because it's got the stereo output?
Yes. No.
I honestly don't know.
So I tell people all the time with the Iridium is when the room knob is all the way off, it's very stale. It's like amp in a box, very like dull. When you turn up the room, it feels like it's right next to you. So it feels more lively, but like because it has the mono sum or stereo switch on the little dip on the input on the back. It's not the input, the output. It's overall a master, so it's not individual sides. So that's with the Iridium where I run. Like
so both A and B, like if you're going mono into it, both A and B are the same image.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then this makes it easy if you wanted to say use an Iridium to run wet dry, because you'd go mono in, because again, none of the dry amps had stereo inputs. So you're going mono in. I would take the left channel, have that go dedicated to my dry channel on the mixer. And then I would take the right and I would feed the wet effects from there. And then those would then break out into stereo. And then you'd have your stereo wet effects and you'd have your dry that would be coming off the left output of the Iridium. Because if they're the same on both sides, then that would be, I think, the easiest way to execute that. And you could have your full wet, dry, wet rig.
And there's an editor, not an editor. They have like you can upload IRs. I don't go into the whole IRs. I don't have the time. I think I had just posted, I commented on one of Grant's posts about what irritates you about your board or something. I was like, that mine's literally never together. Like I'm going to show you. If you're on YouTube, give me a second. This is what mine looks like right now. It's like,
oh yeah.
It's got the jingle. It's bad.
Yeah.
So like me, shoot, I was gonna say. So like having like I have like the Iridiums and stuff off the board, but yeah, no, the with the editor, you can go in and switch out the IRs and everything, and you can actually change what the IR is for each side. So like I used David Hislop's for a while on mine. I just haven't had the time to upload them, but you can change like what the cabinet is for each side. The amp is the same, but I'm not into that, but some people really like it, and they do really sound great. I just don't have time to fiddle with it when my kids are screaming at me and come play with me. So, using an Iridium is simple. That's when it comes down to is simple. I get really good tone. I've had the ACS one, the Iridiums, the HX knobs. I've had them all, and they're all great units. It's just a matter of kind of shaping your tone, because what I play and what my other guitars play, our tones are different because of our taste. So, it gets the job done for me, and I love it.
I think one of the other things that's very important to consider, and if you've never done it, you'd never think to do this with a wet dry rig. Firstly, is putting your Iridium in the middle of your chain is awesome. And just like you said, it can open up possibilities for dry output. Even doing experiments, I prefer it early in the chain than at the very end, where you would just logically think the Iridium should go after your reverbs and all that. So that aside, I think the other thing to really consider with a wet dry or wet dry wet rig is being able to mute easily your dry amp. Just your dry amp, not your wet. Because if you do an ambient sound, as an example, and if you think practically what's going on in an ambient sound is you want to kind of create that pad, keyboardy kind of washed out sound. And if you're doing this alternate picking really quick and you can't mute your dry amp, you're going to get this beautiful pad out of your wet effects. But your dry amp's still coming through. So your dry amp is going to get this on top of this ambient pad you're trying to create. So if you can't mute your dry amp, you're going to struggle to do an ambient type sound. If you don't need to do ambience, then you probably don't need a mute, but you'll just need a master mute. But that's something you really need to consider as well. So with that example of the Iridium, one side goes to dry, one side goes to wet. The only caveat I would say personally, for my preferences, is having a mute or some option there right before your dry amp input.
In you're talking about this from the purposes of swells and
just
like
any ambient sound, anything where you normally wash out your dry signal if you're running a series board. Now you won't be able to do that anymore because you don't have any wet effects to wash it out going to your dry amp only.
Yeah, and so in your when you would set up a rig in this fashion, would you use, let's say we were doing it in the system or the setup that we were talking about, or the fictitious setup where we would run the left output of the iridium into the dry channel, let's say channel 1 of the mixer, and then the right output would feed the wet effects in stereo, and then those would or I guess it would feed into mono, and then those would split out to stereo, and then you'd have your channel 2 and 3 as the wet left and right. You'd put a volume pedal after the dry output of the iridium, or you'd put one before the dry output of the iridium?
Again, this is personal preference. This is not a blanket statement of what you should do. In my experiments, running a volume pedal for dry only is frustrating, because I'm so used to pulling my volume back and doing swells of my volume that's global. It affects everything. So I would just simply have just a mute button, just an in and an out with a mute that can mute your dry amp only. So the dry amp is on or it's off, and that's it. And so, one of the things that, I focus a lot on is junction boxes. And so even having like the RJM control the dry mute per preset is totally doable. And so you can just create an ambient patch on the RJM or your MIDI controller, and it changes everything on your board, and it can mute the dry amp. So in my opinion, the dry amp, being able to mute it is a key thing to, at the very least, just consider, is it going to help my playing or not? Whereas a lot of guys I chat to didn't even cross their mind. And once I say it, they're like, oh yeah, I'm going to need that. Or nope, doesn't affect me. Don't need a dry mute. Thanks for bringing it up, and we move on.
Because in the dry mute context, though, if you're playing anything, you won't then hear it though in the wet amps if it's muted from that point.
Depends how it's set up. So if the iridium is splitting left to dry, right to wet effects, and you put a mute in between the left output and the dry amp input, then it will only mute the dry amp, and your wet effects can keep going.
Got it.
That's when you buy a custom Goodwood audio junction box for that exact reason. I gotta say, I'm obsessed. Obsessed with your guys's the boxes. I'm serious. I tell people all the time, like, it's the most beautiful box you'll buy because of all the different options. And when you post some of the stuff, and I'm just like, has like 18 XLRs. I don't know what is he doing in the mount. It's like keyboard setup, and I'm just like, I don't know what it does, but it's amazing. It looks beautiful. So that's when you get it.
Well, we all have our obsessions, and routing and junction boxes is definitely mine. But I can't do what you guys do. I'll say that very confidently.
Well, I think this is an interesting thing. One person that comes to mind as a player that utilizes a lot of utilizes volume pedals to create dry and wet mutes is Jimmy Herring. I don't know if you guys know who Jimmy Herring is, but he will use Ernie Ball volume pedals to mute the dry, and then he'll put one after or like after the line out, or like if we're talking about in this sort of Strymon Iridium fashion, he'd basically put one after the left output, which would be the dry, and he'd put one after the right output that would be feeding the wet. So he can actually be his own, front of house person, because by having that volume pedal feeding the wet, you can use that as basically a blend of how much of that signal is coming in. And then he's also got one so he can mix in how much of the total dry volume that he wants. And so he's got two volume pedals that are basically acting as real-time mix controls for the dry signal relative to the wet signal, and then can like ramp them up or down. Or if he does something where, let's say, the delay goes into like oscillation, he can really bring that in and then kind of back it off to something that's maybe more manageable, like as he's using the effect, which is kind of a cool thing.
That's cool. Wow.
I think the other cool thing with all of this is, again, there's so many opinions versus what's factually better or worse in quotes. But the cool thing about all of this is you might be listening to it and you might be interested in what we're chatting about or not, but a wet, dry, wet rig is not, my opinion, the be all and end all of a guitar rig. It is one of many options. And so just because we're dedicating, episode 1 to wet, dry, wet does not mean it should be the goal for every player. It's simply an approach to it. And for some guys, it will fit and it will tick all the boxes of what they're trying to do. For other guys, it's a waste of time, money, effort, you name it. It's just not for them. And so for the guys that this pertains to, a wet, dry, wet rig, I personally love them. I think the separation factor is huge. But other guys I chat to, it couldn't be farther from what they needed. And so I think from my perspective, I just wouldn't want people listening thinking like, okay, so now I need to figure out how to make a wet, dry, wet rig work for me. You absolutely don't. But it's definitely worth at least understanding the foundational principles so you can make up your own mind on if this is something you want to start working towards.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that when we think about, most hit records and things like that a lot of us listen to, presumably most of them were not done with wet, dry, wet rigs. So, if we're thinking about sort of the Mount Rushmore of best guitar tones of all time, probably few, if any, ever utilized this particular type of routing. So, there's that to be said at the end of the day. But looking back, and I'm gonna share the screen again here so if you're on YouTube and you're watching this, you can see I'm pulling the one that Grant had sent me, which we all kind of prompted these same questions. We touched a little bit on the idea in terms of I don't have enough gear or amps to run some of these more complicated signal paths. We talked a bit about venues, I guess to a degree. Brian had mentioned that his in-ears are mono. And we talked, I guess, a little bit about practicality. Is there any of these that we want to kind of come back to and maybe address more specifically for people that might be either considering making the change, and maybe how we could also maybe integrate some advantages if we're not going to go wet, dry, wet about stereo 4-cable method, when those might be advantageous versus not?
Well, I mean, for me, I didn't send it to you, but my most common one, I did two. I reposted, and the other one where they could add, they commented mostly, my place doesn't accommodate it. It's like my front of house only gives me one XLR. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's fine. Because that's a lot of places. I do a lot of... I'll sub in for a lot of different churches in the DFW area, and that's the very common thing. Yep, here's your one line. Only when you get to mega churches like Gateway and then where they have stereo setups, amps, aux boxes, whatever it is. But mostly, it's mostly they can't handle any more lines, and they don't want to, even if they could. They don't want to even try to mix a stereo mix or whatever. I mean, that's the most common one.
So in that case, the best they could do to sort of get that separation then would be the 4-cable method, right? And by that we mean amps with an effects loop. They wanted to get the most possible separation between the dry and wet. 4-cable method would be the way to do it.
There's one other way. I don't want to cut you off. You keep going.
No, I want to hear it. Let's hear the other way.
So what we've done with junctions and what Ron does in the PBC-10, which is another, let's say, approach with some downsides, but effective, is you can still run wet effects in parallel and in kill dry, which I don't know if we're going to cover that today, but parallel effects that don't interact with each other, the wet section. And you can run those in kill dry with a parallel dry below it. So they don't, they're separated. You can mix them back down at the end of the chain to one output and send that to an amp. So now front of house, they will not get individual mixes themselves, but you can mix dry and wet individually of each other and then still send it out one output. So there is a big downside there. I understand that, but you can still run them in parallel even though you're sending to one output.
Yeah, I mean the same thing would I guess I still see it though as being it's in series, but that loop is in parallel with the serial loops. Yep. The downside I would say is in doing it in that fashion, or I guess if you don't have, I guess it's not a downside. If you wanted to do that and you didn't have an RJM, you could get a parallel mixer. So like a Exotic X blender or a Old Blood Noise Endeavor signal blender or the Gig Rig Wetter Box, and you could throw a group of pedals, or I think the Wetter Box has a couple of loops that are stereo. You could throw some effects in there if you didn't have a switcher that could do that. But I hear what you're saying as the alternative. It doesn't allow you though to separate between the preamp and the power amp.
Yeah.
But again, the usage of effects loops is limited. I feel like there's a lot of people that feel like because their amp has an effects loop means that they should use it. And or some manufacturers just put effects loops on everything, it's it's like an extra option. And I found this to be true, and I'm curious about what you guys think. Firstly, it should be known that there is no standard. There's no like effects loop committee that gets together and decides like what the standards should be in terms of impedances or whether buffers should be included in effects loops or the levels of effects loops. Literally, every single company has a different way of doing it, which makes it really hard for people that are building rigs, whether it be Goodwood or Omilion or Vertex or whoever, because we don't really know what we're dealing with from rig to rig. And one of the big challenges with using effects loops is that most of them are not buffered. That means they're passive, which means there's no signal conditioning, which means that the longer the cable runs are that are coming out of that thing, the more it's going to change the tone. And most people will report, even on high quality effects loops, that there is some difference between when they either use pedals in their effects loop versus not. And a big reason for that is that they're mostly passive, so they don't deal real well with a lot of cable capacitance that's going on the send of the effects loop. But the second thing about it is that if your amp is if you're not using the amp to produce gain and distortion, there's no reason to use it. There's almost no advantage anymore of using it, because if the amp's not crunchy, it might as well be treated just as a clean amp. And so you don't need to use your effects loop unless your amplifier is producing distortion. If the pedals are producing distortion and the amp is just used as sort of the pedal platform, no reason to use the effects loop at all. That's my opinion. I'm curious what you guys think.
I did an experiment with this as well. I mean, I love taking these questions that come up and like doing a practical experiment. And I encourage everyone I chat to do the same. Like, don't take my word for it. Try it out for yourself and see what you find, because your rig is only going to be as good as your own ears. And so the experiment I did with this was exactly like you said, Mason, in terms of I plugged in a very simple board, couple gain pedals, delay, reverb into the front of an amp, kept it clean, used the effects loop, kept it clean, didn't need to use the effects loop. As soon as I turned the gain on the amp and overdrove the amp after a delay and a reverb, it started sounding pretty rough. And I think the reason for this, just for people that are starting to wrap their head around this, the reason for that is if you think about putting a overdrive after something that decreases in volume, so a delay repeat will slowly decrease in volume. As you decrease volume going into a gain, like an overdriven source, like an amp with an overdrive on it, it starts to clean up. And so that those delay repeats will start out very overdriven and they'll slowly get cleaner and cleaner every repeat. And it sounds pretty unnatural. Same with a reverb that's slowly decaying. And so I think that's the part of, and I'm sure you guys can expand on this better than I can, but part of the reason, even with my experiment, is why use an amp's effects loop. If you're going to put overdrive in the amp after your delay and your reverb, it's going to start to sound a bit unnatural with those wet effects before it. And so that's why you're now moving your amp, which you're essentially treating like a overdrive. You're trying to put your amp's preamp with the overdrives on your pedal board. And so that's why you would potentially use an amp's effects loop. Or part of the reason why you're trying to use an amp's effects loop is to turn that now overdrive, which is your amp's preamp, put it with your gain stages so that your delays, your reverbs, modulation can be after that. And that's essentially what the amp's effects loop is doing. And I know when I had an amp with an effects loop, I plugged it in and like I'm supposed to use it. It's there. It's exactly like you said. I had no idea what I was doing or why I would even want to use an amp's effects loop, but I plugged it in. Didn't sound as good, but I was like, I'm supposed to. So I did.
Right.
And so I think the why, and please, tell me what I'm missing here, guys, but a big part of it is you're just trying to run your overdrives with your overdrives and your wet effects with your wet effects, and try and keep them in that order to get that sound that you're really trying to go for. And so if you're listening and wondering why 4-cable method, why an amps effects loop, that's part of it.
Ryan, anything to add?
Yeah. I get a lot of people through the shop asking about effects loops and as well. And my boss and I, we carpool every morning together, and we're always talking about amps and effects loops and how certain things work. And he always explained it as, and this is how a lot of people see it. They're like, oh yeah, like Grant said, you have to separate the dry and the wet. And I get the person that goes, well, I just needed to not muddy up my mix. And I was like, what do you mean? Well, when I stack on 5 overdrives, it muddies up how my reverb and delay sound. Like, you stack anything on that, it's going to do that. Like, that's how it is. And I worked for an amp company for years and loved them to death. And some of our amps didn't have effects loops, purely because they didn't need them. And I was one of the kids growing up that was like, well, it has an effects loop, you got to plug something into it. Like, it's got a jack, you should, like on whatever switcher, it's like, got to use every single, input, output as possible. So I started doing the effects loop routing and everything. And I didn't hear what people said that they hear. Oh yeah, I hear clarity. That was a big one, was clarity, and it makes your delay and reverb, a lot more crisper and all this kind of stuff. And I get some people that are like, oh yeah, I hear that. And then I get some people who are like, oh no, I can't hear that, because by the time I get it in my mix, I can't tell the difference. Or they're not going to be able to, the big one is they're not going to be able to tell the difference in the audience. I was like, yeah, that's really true. But I mean, there are some pedal platform amps that do sound better cranked up. There are, like, I'm edge of breakup kind of thing with the Iridium. But there are some that take really well the pedals and effects loops, and there's just some that are out there that just don't, because they're not, they are designed for that. They just react differently. That's what I've seen. Like, every amp, I only have one amp but I've had a couple amps, and like, they all react differently. Every build I have, I get people like, well, I have 6 different amps and I have to change my knobs. Like, well, yeah, it's because all gear is different. They all react differently to different things. So your effects loop might sound good in your whatever 2-rock, but then you put it in a Bogner and it might sound different. Like whatever amp it is. So I mean, that's a big part, is everyone is just like reaching for the cleanest possible signal in the world, so they think going effects loop is going to fix it, when sometimes it's not the case. That's not personally.
Yeah. I think it all comes back to the thing where there are no standards, and it's completely understandable and should be expected that if you're switching different amps that don't have, or that have, effects loops in them, and you're moving the gear between them, like, you're most certainly going to have to make adjustments, because, as I said, there's no impedance standard, there's no level standard. Some amps do have buffered effects loops. Some of them have controls for the level. Some of them have level controls on the send and return. It's so variable. One product that I've talked about before in some of our videos that I do think is really helpful, if you have a variety of effects loops, most of them are typically passive. And this basically takes a passive effects loop and turns it in to an active one, and it's called the clinulator. And in essence, what it is a solid state pedal version of a Dumbolator, which was the effects loop device that Dumble had made to basically retrofit his amps with, to turn their passive effects loops into active or buffered effects loops. And so if you're looking at this on YouTube, you'll be able to see this. If you're listening to it, I'll do my best to sort of explain the visual here. But essentially, it's a Hammond 1590 BB size box, to kind of give you a size reference that's about the same size as an MXR flanger, the 117 flanger that like Eddie Van Halen used. It's got 4 jacks on it, an input, an output, a send and return, and then has a 9-volt input for the power. And then it has 3 controls on it: a send level, a return level, and then a recovery level, which I think is a type of like a tone control of some kind, in addition to some toggle switches that are helping to adjust the tone on the send and return. So in essence, the input and output would connect to your effects loop send and return. And then it provides you a new group of sends and returns that would then feed the pedals on your pedal board. So this is in essence driving the line out to the pedal board from the effects loop with a low impedance signal. And then when you come back, you have the ability to make up any gain that you've attenuated. Because sometimes, let's say you have an effects loop that's producing line level, which many of them do, that's about plus 4 dB. So you can attenuate that send down, because Brian was talking about how some pedals don't accept the effects loop. They'll distort because the line is so hot, and my Boss pedal or fill in the blank pedal won't accept that hot of a signal. So I'm going to attenuate it with my send control on this box. But then when I go back to the amp, I need it to be back at line level again, because it was a line level effects loop. So I can use this return knob now to bring the level back up to where I wanted it to be, so that there isn't any volume difference between using the effects loop versus not. And then you can kind of trim out the recovery and bright switches accordingly, so that you get the clearest example of what your amp would sound like if the effects loop weren't engaged. And usually the easiest way, I think, to do that is, play without any of the effects on in the effects loop, unplug this box from the effects loop, and then play again and sort of tune it based on that. But I think that box is the only thing I'm aware of that can do this, that can take an effects loop that's passive and make it active. Grant?
No, I'm just pointing to your Boost MK2 right behind me.
Oh, I thought you were pointing out to the sky, like the only person that can fix this is Jesus.
No. Well, some of these issues, it sometimes feels like it, but no, I mean, your Boost MK2 as well. I mean, maybe you don't want to toot your own horn here. It doesn't have all the same controls as what you just listed, but it can also turn a passive effects loop into a buffered. It can double as a great boost. I mean, I'll toot your horn for you, man.
Same.
But it's a great pedal as well.
Yeah. It doesn't, the thing that it lacks is you can't use it at, like, if you were using the buffer on the send with the volume control, you can't attenuate on mine. So it only goes to 0, no volume boost, which in some amps may be fine if it has a level. Some of them will put like a level compensation, even if it's passive, where you can knock it down to minus 20 on it. And in that case, this would work just fine. But if it didn't have that and it's just like wide open, then even my boost cannot help you. And then you have to get something like the Kleinulator. But it's a really cool pedal. And for what it costs, I think that the list price on it is about $150.
Wow.
It's pretty great for making that happen. If you want to have something that basically makes all, you could use it with any effects loop and really just make any of your amps impervious to the pedals that you want to use. Of course, you may have to make some adjustments, as Brian said. You can't just expect that every system is going to react exactly the same. But I think it definitely decreases the threshold or the margin with which you need to, sort of be aware of when you're using effects in the loop.
Love it.
Anything else we want to say about effects loop, the last word in effects loops?
I think, honestly, the only thing I would say, I'm just going to be a broken record here, is just try it out for yourself. Like, do these experiments yourself. The last thing I would want anyone to do is just say, oh, Grant said I should do this, or Mason said, or Omilion said I should always use an Iridium. Like, absolutely not. It's just a starting point for you to experiment. And I think taking that approach to your rig of, I will test it out myself and I will see if what I can hear personally, that approach will serve you for years and years to come. And I wish I would have taken that approach earlier, because I would have saved thousands on mistakes of gear that I bought because I just thought I was supposed to.
Yeah.
So I would just say, use what we're saying here today as a starting point with effects loops, and, take 20 minutes and plug in a few different configurations, maybe record them in GarageBand or Logic, whatever, and just see what you can hear with some purposeful listening exercises and see if it's actually worth the trouble.
Yeah, I agree with that. I tell a lot of people, don't pick, I don't know if you guys can hear me, don't pick what you're going to be, that pedal that you're looking for or that amp sim or whatever off of a video. If you have a local guitar shop that has it, go there, try it out, borrow friends. Some online sites, they'll rent stuff and you can try it out, which is super cool. But I've had so many people go, oh yeah, I hate the Iridium. Why'd you hate it? Oh, it sounded terrible on that video. Well, did you try it in person? No, I didn't get a chance to try it in person, but it just sounded terrible in the video. I'm like, well, the person that did the video could have made a terrible video. I mean, there's so many aspects when it comes to delay and reverb, everything. So yeah, I'm with that. Get it, whatever it is, test out the configuration, make it look as messy as possible, make it look like a rat's nest. Try it out, see if it sounds great. The times I spent as a teenager on the floor, which a lot of people are like, oh, that was yesterday, because I guess I look young, but people, like, I sat on the floor of my parents' house with a rat's nest of cables to figure out like how I wanted my overdrive, order at the time to be or whatever, or my delay and reverb. For the longest time I ran delay last. Found out that was not how I liked it and not correct. So like those different things, as I found out by experimenting, when someone could be on not YouTube at the time, but could be online and be like, don't do this. I'm like, oh, the guy in the forum said don't do it. Like, just do it. Try it yourself. It's your rig, it's your money, it's your kind of thing. Like, make the tone your thing. The Edge, got what he got by testing stuff. So test stuff out. Don't be afraid to test out stuff. We test out new gear all the time. So life of a guitarist.
Yeah, I think a lot of this stuff, I noticed that a lot of people will come to us or to guys like, you two, and will kind of want you to sort of solve their problem for them when we can't plan for them for their taste, because we don't really know what they're attuned to, and I think a lot of people, I notice, want to take shortcuts or have somebody kind of like give them sort of a paint by number equivalent of what to do with their pedal board. And certainly there are some standards or some common ways of doing things, but they may not always align with what that person actually hears. And the only way that you can sort of calibrate yourself is to actually do these experiments. And it takes time and it takes some investment. And so I think that I'm in complete agreement that you can't be lazy if you're trying to create your own sound. Like, I could understand if you needed to have more of a template if you were going after a really specific sound. If you're in a Stevie Ray Vaughan cover band, well, we can give you a pretty good idea of exactly the type of effects that you're going to need to be able to cover that sound. But if you're creating your own sound and you're saying, well, where should I put this effect, or should I put delay before reverb, or should I put my volume pedal here, or should I use lighter overdrive before heavier overdrive, or fill in the blank sort of question that's sort of like there's more than one right answer thing. We can only speak to what we like, and ultimately you're going to be the best guide to where destination Tone Town is, because
I've never found it.
Yeah, you never been to Tone Town?
No.
It's Guitar Sanctuary.
Just there you go.
McKinney, Texas.
Yeah.
There you go.
Come on over.
No, that's great. I love hearing your guys' opinions on this stuff. I mean, I know there's people listening right now, but it's good just hearing, getting out of my oown head a little bit more and hearing how you guys approach this stuff and where we overlap and where we might differ a bit. I'm getting a lot out of this, so I appreciate it.
Same.
Yeah, I think it's great, and I think that we're hearing three, I think in some ways really similar approaches, and I think in other senses we sort of have different contexts and different approaches, and I think that this is really good for anybody that's listening. They sort of everything sort of gets tempered a little bit by each of our own experiences, and ultimately, again, I think that this is sort of like the powerhouse of rig builders right here. We got Grant from Goodwood, and we got Brian from Omilion Audio, and I think that in terms of people on the map of sort of the younger generation of rig builders, it's between the two of you guys, we kind of got the whole thing wrapped up right here. So I think that this is really valuable information, and I think we touched on a bunch of really important things about wet, dry, wet, the kind of the historical context, the way that it's sort of morphed. We've talked about the usage of digital representations of cabinets for the wet sound. We've talked about 4-cable method. We've talked about using digital amp simulations with the Strymon Iridium switchers, RJM. We got a lot of good stuff today. I think that this is a good note for us to kind of summarize and wrap up. Any final thoughts that you think we need to plug in here for these sorts of rigs, these sorts of setups, and some of the kind of poll questions that we were fielding this week that we want to kind of complete with?
I think the only thing I would encourage people to check out after this is absolutely all of your videos on YouTube, Mason. It's essentially an encyclopedia for guitar players and common questions that come up, and some awesome content on there. As far as specific wet, dry, wet stuff, I would definitely encourage guys, if you're interested in this and this topic of wet, dry, wet, definitely look into the difference between what it means to run series wet effects and parallel wet effects. That's something that you just need to hear it to really understand how it affects your tone. We could describe it, but you really just need to hear it. And it's basically the difference of your wet effects interacting with each other in series or not interacting with each other in parallel. And so I would just say look that up if you're interested in wet, dry, and wet, dry, wet. But other than that, I mean, I think we've covered a lot of the key foundational components for people to consider. Yeah. And so from here, I'd say get on YouTube, check out Mason's channel. I do a couple on wet, dry, wet and series and parallel, and Omilion is like eye candy on Instagram for anything to do with a setup. Like unbelievable what this guy pulls off. So
thank you.
Yeah, that's all I would say is check that stuff out.
Brian, any final thoughts?
It's not, I mean, yeah, I would say ask questions too. I'm not afraid of getting a message that's just a question. I get messages, it's like, how much is the rig cost, that kind of thing. But like, if you have a question about something, message one of us about it. Don't feel like no question is a dumb question. I will say I've had one dumb question. But it wasn't me, it was a friend, and I'm not ever going to repeat it. But no, really, when it comes down to it, is like, even us three would not be where we are without have asked questions. So don't be afraid to ask us questions or someone else that you admire a question or something. Me, I grew up loving Nigel Hendroff from Hillsong, like his tone and his stuff. And I finally got to meet him and I asked him a ton of questions and he's like, oh yeah, it's all real simple. And I was like, what? Like, it's that simple? He's like, yeah, you could have asked anyone that. And the boss was at the time was like, yeah, you could have asked me that. I was like, shoot, I didn't, because I thought it was a dumb question. So, sometimes that dumb question you think is dumb is not, and it's simple. So, feel free to reach out to, I would say, any of us, because why not?
Yeah, or if you're watching this on YouTube or you're listening to this on one of the podcatchers, you can head over to YouTube and there will be a comment section that's paired with the video, and you can always put your commentary there, and that's something that any of us can answer, whether it's me or Brian or Grant. And we may even have slightly different variations on the same question, so you can kind of get a 3-for-1 on a lot of this stuff, where you kind of get 3 different ways to do it, and you can attempt to try all 3 and see which one works the best for you. Because ultimately, almost all this stuff is a matter of taste. It's not a binary thing when it comes to tone. It's all subjective. The way I hear things is going to be different than the way that Brian hears things, which is going to be different than the way that Grant hears things. And our preferences and proclivities are going to be just a reflection of our various experiences, and your experiences can be different too than those. So just kind of keeping that all in mind. I think it's all good stuff. It's like pizza. It's all good. Unless you go to Chuck E. Cheese, that pizza's terrible.
Just about to say, no better way to finish it off. And then Chuck E. Cheese came in there.
About to say.
And if people want to reach out, we should just finish off with this. They want to reach out to Goodwood. They want to reach out to Brian at Omilion Audio. What are the ways that they can do that if they're listening to this and they don't have all the fancy links that YouTube has? How do they find you guys? How do they reach out to you about rig builds, junction boxes, all that good stuff?
Take it away,
Brian, we'll start with you.
Me? Okay, I don't ever want to like overlap someone. Honestly, mine is just through Instagram, at Omilion Audio, OMILION. I always say it's 0 million with one L because I can't afford the second L. So that's honestly my best way. I have people that will call. You can call if you want. You can send me an email.
Call the Guitar Sanctuary?
Yeah, you could call the Guitar Sanctuary. It's, I got a card. Hold on. 972-540-6420. I've been here for like 5 years. I should know that number. But I like, you can call, but I like Instagram messages because I can organize those conversations. Emails are also great too. It's just my last name, Omilion, at theguitarsanctuary.com. It's super long, so I suggest going to Instagram. So that's it for me.
All right. And Grant?
Goodwood Audio on Instagram, info at Goodwood Audio on email, and through our website, goodwoodaudio.com. There's a lot of Goodwood Audio in there.
I like it.
Any of those will work and come straight to us.
Awesome. Yeah. So I think that was a great conversation, guys. I will look forward to our next topic next week. And if you're interested in participating in kind of having some of your questions answered, we're going to have sort of weekly Instagram story interactions and things of that nature. So if you're not following us on Instagram, make sure that you follow Omilion Audio and Goodwood and Vertex, and we'll make sure that we are including user-generated questions as much as possible, and really making sure that not only do these cover, generalized topics in the rig building, pedalboard, and gear field, but it's also maybe addressing some troubleshooting related stuff, and maybe we can even reserve a section of each episode to really go over those sorts of things, or have a little section where we address some of these challenges that are happening in the world of gear in tone. And thanks everybody for listening and or watching, depending on where you're getting this. Thanks Brian for being here.
Thank
and
you.
Grant for being here. I'm really grateful we can make this happen, and just democratizing good tone.
Yeah.
Love it.
Love it.
Yeah.
All right,
Thanks
guys.
for having us.
Thank
See
you.
you guys.
See ya.